instructions, listening to our brother's talk this evening. Now, I give this time to Brother Josh for his study, Fishers and Hunters. Brother Josh.
Thank you very much, Brother Nathan, and good evening to you all once again. Lovely once again to see so many names that I recognise. Good to be sharing this time with you. So now let me just share my screen so that we can continue. All right, hopefully you can see that now. All right, so we're going to continue in our series, and tonight is study 3, and we're looking at the general theme of Israel, the apple of his eye. That's God's eye, of course. And study 3, we're looking at fishers and hunters. And as you can appreciate, we've had somewhat of a dramatic encounter with Israel's history as it's presented to us in pages of scripture and also on the page of history. And we come tonight to what is a particularly dark period of Israel's history. But if we're going to appreciate all that God is doing with his nation, then we are necessarily exposed to both the light and some of the dark shade that represents the history, the nature of the history that belongs to this people. And of course, it's a people that's very dear to our hearts because we know that God has a plan and purpose with them, which is not dead and is going to be fulfilled because of his love that he has to the fathers of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and because of the promises that he made to them, which we know are fulfilled in our Lord Jesus Christ. So we have seen how the nation was ejected from its homeland in AD 70 when the Romans came through Judea and finally destroyed the temple and dispersed the Jews into all nations. And sadly, we saw that the plight of that nation in all the lands which they were scattered to was one of heartache and misery, just as God foretold that it would be. Remember, they were God's covenant people. They are God's covenant people, but there were to be consequences for them forsaking the covenant, and certainly consequences for their rejection of Jesus, their Messiah. And one of the things which is so interesting to historians, as we've begun to see, is that when you look at the experiences of the Jews in all the countries and all the lands that they were scattered in, there is something quite disturbing and at the same time quite remarkable about their experience. And we talked about it last time, didn't we? We spoke about this phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which occurs when the Jews are living in foreign lands. This is a almost irrational hatred of the Jews. And one historian here says that as a historian of anti-Semitism, as one looks back over the millennia of horrors that he has recorded, an inescapable conclusion emerges. Anti-Semitism is different because of its longevity and its consistency. So it's not like you have a small group of people who are out of favor for a small period of time and everybody, doesn't like them anymore, but they get over it and they move on. The remarkable thing about the Jews' experience is that this anti-Semitism followed them into whatever land they spent time in. They became the object of people's derision, people's hatred, people's violence, wherever they went. And historians almost scratch their head when they try to get an understanding of why that would be. Why would it last so long? Why would it be so consistent? And we know that the scriptures have the answer for us. This is something that God made very clear would be their experience because of their rejection of him. Now, we have been spending a little bit of time in Deuteronomy, and I want to just remind you of a couple of verses here, which you can say contain deadly serious warnings for a people who would forsake the covenant. You remember in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and in verse 19, God says, or Moses said, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. So that was the encouragement. Make the right decision. Choose life. Live before God. Be obedient to the covenant. But of course, Deuteronomy chapter 28 details what would happen if they forsook the covenant, if they turned their back on God. The Lord, says Deuteronomy 28 and verse 35, will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and you shall be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth, and your dead body shall be food for all the birds of the air and for the beasts of the earth, and there shall be no one to frighten them away. Now that is disturbing imagery and language. But you can see what really is happening here. In Deuteronomy 30, God's saying, choose life. But if you choose to forsake me, it is the choice that will result in death. Now, the reason that's important when we come to thinking about our subject tonight is because our next passage, our next scripture that we want to look at is in Ezekiel chapter 37. And in Ezekiel chapter 37, we have a chapter which you probably know well, but I just want you to think about the first 2 verses to begin with. Ezekiel, of course, is brought by the Spirit of the Lord, and he's set down, says verse 1, in the middle of a valley. And the valley is described as being full of bones. In verse 2, and he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. And if these bones in this valley are very dry, then what does this tell us? It tells us that they have been in this state for a very long time. And what is this state? It is a death state. And this is representative of Israel. And so the bones represent disobedient and unrepentant Israel who chose death rather than life. This is the sad state that the nation has been brought to because of their rejection of God. But the wonderful thing about Ezekiel 37 is that God does not forsake his people. He does not forsake his covenant. Remember, we said this very much at the beginning of our study. Although Israel may turn their back on their covenant with God, God is faithful, and he will not go back. He will not renege. He will not turn away from the covenant because of his love to the fathers. And so it's no surprise then Ezekiel 37 goes on to describe something quite remarkable. And first of all, Ezekiel is challenged. He says to me, Son of man, can these bones live? Now, I'm sure if you are there and I am there and we're being asked this question, we would want to say impossible, right? And maybe that's Ezekiel's private thought, but you can never say impossible if it's an angel speaking to you, right? And so he says maybe what is the most intelligent thing to say in that moment. Oh Lord, you know, right? Oh Lord, you know. I can't say, but oh Lord, you know. Verse 4, then he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. I mean, what amazing thing is this? Dry bones hearing at all? Thus says the Lord God to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So what is described is this national resurrection, and not just a resurrection, but a conversion. What we're going to see in the next couple of studies is that what is spoken about really is the fact that the children of Israel would be converted back to their God. They would be brought back into a covenant relationship with him. That's the remarkable thing. Even after having been out of the land, out of covenant relationship for so many years, that their hope is now dry, completely dry, shriveled up. No hope from a human perspective. That's going to change, is what Ezekiel is going to say. All right, we're going to leave Ezekiel there for now. And we're just going to visit now Jeremiah chapter 16, which we read. And Jeremiah chapter 16 is interesting because Jeremiah, you remember, is prophesying at the time when the children of Israel were going to go into Babylonian captivity. And of course, they were going to come back from Babylonian captivity. But he has a prophecy here which I believe is clearly about more than just their return from Babylon. Okay, so have a look at verse 14 to 16. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country, and out of all the countries where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers. So what verse 15 is doing is it's envisaging a time when Israel will not just be scattered up in Assyria or in Babylon, but out of all countries, they're going to have to be brought back. In other words, they're going to be scattered further and wider than this. And verse 16 seems to describe the method, the way in which God is going to bring them back to the land. And so verse 16 says, behold, I am sending for many fishers, declares the Lord, and they will catch them. And afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill and out of the clefts of the rocks. Now, I just want you to think about this imagery of fishers and hunters, because the way verse 16 is written, it seems that there is a distinction made between a fisherman and a hunter. Now, you might say, well, they're both hunting, right? I mean, a fisherman is hunting fish, and a hunter is maybe hunting land creatures. And that's true. They're both hunters in one sense. But I think that if we think about a fisher and a hunter, their method is a little bit different. One might say that a fisherman is just a little bit more passive. He's maybe on the boat or he's maybe on the bank, and he wants to entice the fish. He wants to lure the fish and then catch. Whereas a hunter is much more proactive, intentional, going into the caves, up into the mountains, down into the ravines. A hunter is ferreting out the catch for himself. And so I think that what we are seeing here is two phases almost of God's methodology, if you like, of bringing out the people from the nations back to their own land. So that's my suggestion about this verse. And what I'm going to hopefully show is that history seems to bear this interpretation out. But I'll let you see what you think about this. Now, remember last class we saw how anti-Semitism spread and continued right from the time of AD 70, right through to the Middle Ages and up into the late Middle Ages. And our story starts tonight by commenting on the fact that the Jews by this stage were scattered all over Europe. By the time we get to the 17, 18, 1900s, there are Jews in just about every country of Europe, and they are being persecuted wherever they go. And in the 19th century, the really big focus of that persecution was in the area of Eastern Europe and Russia. And we have this area in Europe which was called the Pale of Settlement. It was a boundary place, and the Jews were supposed to be confined to this area only. They were not allowed to go outside the Pale. They weren't allowed to go beyond the Pale of Settlement. And you might think, well, at least they're safe inside this area. And unfortunately, no, they were not. They were subject time and time and time again to pogroms. Now, this is an interesting word. It means to destroy, to wreak havoc, and demolish violently. It's like a persecution, but very intense. And there were very significant pogroms that were occurring throughout the centuries, of course, in many places, but with specific intensity in the 19th century in these areas. There's the Warsaw pogrom, the Kishinev pogrom, the Kiev pogrom, etc., etc. And always the Jews were violently murdered, whole families destroyed, all their possessions taken, their houses taken, their synagogues burned. Very, very familiar kind of scene happening again and again and again. And it was during this time that some intellectual and academic Jews began to see just how crazy this situation was and began to think this is never going to change for us. We need to come up with a solution. And the big, bold, imagined solution was that Israel or the Jews would one day have their own homeland again. And some said, well, it would be great if we could have a land in Palestine, back where we used to be as a people, with Jerusalem once again as our capital. And remember that all the way through the Middle Ages, the Jews had greeted each other with this phrase, next year in Jerusalem. In fact, they had sung it at Passover or Sabbath each week. Next year in Jerusalem. And as I said, some of these men were thinking about this predicament, this situation of their people, and they began to found and further this movement that they called the Zionist movement. And this man here, Theodor Herzl was his name. He was from Austria originally, and he was the founder of the modern Zionist movement. And he wrote a small booklet in 1896, and the booklet was called Der Judenstaat, means the Jewish state. The Jewish state. And here was his bold idea. He said, Zionism demands a publicly recognized and legally secured homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. This platform is unchangeable. And so he began to try to entice people, Jews, fellow Jews, to get involved with this program. He became a fisherman, if you like, all right? And he wanted to get Jews excited about the idea of leaving their homes in Europe or Russia or Spain, all these places where you can't really call these places home. You can't really feel safe. You can't really know when the next pogrom is going to occur. Let's go to our own land. Let's start our own state. And so he began to generate interest amongst many people for this idea. And in 1897, just 1 year after he wrote his little booklet, he convened the first Zionist Congress, which was a gathering of like-minded Jews in Switzerland in 1897. And he said, in Basel, and that's a little place in Switzerland, he said, at that place, I founded the Jewish state. And if I said this out loud today, I would be answered by laughter. If not in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. And he said that in 1897. And it's remarkable that about 50 years later, there was a Jewish state founded in Palestine. All right, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. But he had what we would say in Australia, we would call it an uphill battle, right? He had a very difficult challenge ahead of him to get people interested in this idea. It did not look possible. One of the main reasons why it did not look possible was because this was the map around about that time. And Jerusalem and the land of Palestine was still in the hands and under the control of the Ottoman Empire, okay, modern day Turkey. So it's not like the land was sitting vacant and nobody was, occupying it or interested in it. It wasn't accessible, really. And it's interesting because this led some people to say to Theodor Herzl, why don't you have an area in Africa instead? Why don't we give you somewhere in Africa? Uganda is a nice place. Why don't you found your Jewish state in Uganda? And of course, some of the Jews, and even Herzl on one occasion, started to think maybe that's what we have to do. But no, that's not the land for God's people. And many of the Jews knew that instinctively. And of course, one of the most amazing events then happened to change the map, and that was World War One. World War One lasted from 1914 to 1918. And we won't go into all the history and the detail of this war, But one of the major impacts of the war was that afterward, the Ottoman Empire no longer had control of the land of Palestine. And all the way through the war, there were prominent and important Jews who could see that things were changing. And so they were lobbying powerful individuals in the British government and elsewhere to try to secure favorable thoughts towards the Jews so that after the war, there might be the opportunity for them to have their own land. And one of the people who was very active in trying to convince the British leaders was a man named Chaim Weizmann. And it's a very interesting story because Chaim Weizmann had helped the British government in the war. And so he had access to many of these powerful British men. And a member of the House of Lords asked Chaim Weizmann, he said, "Why do you Jews insist on Palestine? There are so many other and undeveloped countries. You could settle there much more conveniently." And Weizmann replied, "That is like my asking you why you drove 20 miles to visit your mother last Sunday when there are so many old ladies living on your street." Okay, great answer. And he went on, "Mr. Balfour, if you were offered Paris instead of London, would you take it?" And Lord Balfour looked surprised. He said, "But London is our own. London belongs to us." And Weizmann replied, "Jerusalem was ours when London was a marsh, when London was still a swamp, when London was completely undeveloped and uninhabited. We Jews had a temple in Jerusalem." Okay, and so slowly but surely, all the powerful people were starting to think, yes, the Jews do have a home in Palestine. And so what we had was this Balfour Declaration in 1917. And it was a decision, or a letter really, which said that we view with favor the idea of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And we will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. And of course, Britain didn't know exactly how things were going to transpire after the finish and the conclusion of World War I, but they basically promised the Zionist movement that they would help them if they could. Well, as we said, the war did change the map, and Jewish immigration to Palestine began to pick up in the very early 20th century. Not much at all, as you can see. From 1900 through to 1925, slowly Jews that were motivated by the Zionist movement began to return to the land. And then after the World War finished, there was what was called the British Mandate of Palestine. The Ottoman Empire dried up and the land became under the control of the British, and they were in a very difficult position because there were Arabs, Muslim Arabs living already in that area. And so they tried to let some Jews in and then limit the return and immigration. But gradually, the Jews started to come in, but still not in very, very large quantities, just little by little. Slowly, they were being lured and enticed back to the land by this Zionist dream. Well, meanwhile, the situation in Europe was just after World War One. Post-war Europe was a very, very troubled place. Germany had lost the war, but Germany was going through tremendous upheaval and tumult. And there was finally a political figure that came into the spotlight. And in 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power. Now, Adolf Hitler had been gradually becoming more and more powerful through the 1920s. And one of the things that Germany was dealing with was the humiliation of having lost the First World War. And so one of the things which became fake news, false information, stories, lies, which the nation told itself, is that the only reason they lost the war in World War One was because they had been stabbed in the back by Jews and communists. Okay? And what began to really grow very, very strongly during this period was anti-Semitism to a level that it had not been seen in Germany before. It had always been in Germany, anti-Semitism, but now it was becoming much, much more potent, much, much more dark and disturbing. And the Nazi Party, the political movement inspired by Adolf Hitler, began to demonize the Jew. They decided to unite all the German people by giving them a common enemy, and the enemy, the common enemy, was the Jew. And it's amazing to see how much this hatred of the Jews spread throughout Germany. They would have movies about the evil Jews shown in the cinema in Germany. They would have cartoons and storybooks for children. This one called The Poisonous Mushroom, all about the Jews. And so they were starting to indoctrinate the children about how all the problems in the world because of the Jews. And they're teaching here in the classroom how you can tell a Jew from the shape of their nose, things like this. And if you go to the Germany in the early or 1930s and 1920s, you're starting to see these kinds of images, these kinds of signs. Jews are unwanted here. Or in the middle picture, we have a group of soldiers standing outside a Jewish shop with these signs saying, Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from the Jews. And the Jews are having their shops graffitied and destroyed. During this time, there are laws that are now being passed. If you are a Jew, you are not allowed to date or to marry a German. They do not want the blood poisoned by Jewish blood. And if you are a Jew, pretty soon in Germany, you need to wear a special star on your clothes that you sew on to show people that you are a Jew, so people can avoid you. Okay? So the hatred is increasing. And smart Jews, some of them could see this is not going to end well. We know our history. We know this is dangerous. And so there were a lot of Jews between 1933 and 1939 that started to get out of Germany and to flee from the persecution. And as you can see there, even 700 or so made it all the way to the Philippines. There was a real turning point in this period, and it was in 1938 with the night called Kristallnacht, which is in German, it means the night of broken glass. And this was a large series of pogroms which were launched against the Jewish population all across Germany. And it was called the Night of Broken Glass because there was shattered glass all over the pavement. And businesses and shops that were owned by Jews were destroyed, synagogues were burned. And it's actually quite amazing if you look at a map of Germany and you see all those black dots, they represent cities where synagogues were destroyed in 1938. It's amazing how all the way across the nation there was this destruction of Jewish homes, synagogues, and shops. And this was only the next stage because it continued. And between 1936 and 1938, the Jews began to be rounded up and put into concentration camps, put especially in areas which they could no longer have any contact with the outside world. So really, they had been dehumanized. In the mind of the Nazis, they are just insects, okay? And it was horrific what happens next because Adolf Hitler in 1939 made it very clear in a big speech. He said, if war erupts, it will mean the extermination of the European Jews. Not just the, let's get them out, let's send them to another country. No, no, the extermination of the Jews. And of course, we are entering now a period of history where technology is such that if another pogrom breaks out, it's not going to be like anything else that is seen in history that's gone before, in the centuries that have gone past. Now we are living in the industrial age, and we see that this has an effect on what happens next. Well, war did break out. You will know, some of you, that this photo here is in Iwo Jima, which is very close to the Philippines. So the war was all the way over in the Pacific, wasn't it? And of course, Japan invaded the Philippines at this time. And Japan was an ally with Germany. But really, the main story from our point of view is happening in Europe. That's where all the Jews are. And I know that the Philippines suffered greatly under the Japanese. But that's not our story tonight. We're looking at what happened in the theater of Europe. And in Europe during that time, it's amazing to see how many Jews there were. There was 6.7 million Jews in Eastern Europe. So all of that green area on the map, 6.7 million Jews living there. There was about 1.6 million Jews living in Central Europe, right there in Germany. And then many other Jews scattered in other areas as well. And you have to understand that from the Nazis' point of view, they see the Jew as nothing more than vermin. They see them now as the cause of all of their troubles. Anti-Semitism has been has been whipped up now to such an extent that many people are going to be complicit in what happens next. And I just want to warn you that this is a very dark period of Jewish history, because we are now speaking about the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is a term for the mass murder of around 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime during the Second World War. Holocaust is sometimes called the Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for catastrophe. This was a horror, a catastrophe. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis' plan was to eliminate all Jews from Europe, and they were murdered and transported to extermination camps. Now, some of you will know that the German military expanded rapidly and took lots of the areas in Eastern Europe and also France. And in those places, they set up death camps. That's all you can say about them. They are camps. They were extermination camps, places where Jews were taken just to be killed. And what you can see there on the screen is the gray deportation routes. So this is where all the train lines converged and went to these places in Poland, many of them, where they set up these places of extermination. And thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews were put in these cattle cars and transported to these camps. And we know this happened because we have pictures now, and it's in museums all over the world, showing what happened to the Jews. This is Jews being taken off the train in Auschwitz, which is one of the biggest death camps. And the Jews in this place were shaved. They had all their belongings confiscated, and then they were taken into special rooms that had been built for the purpose of gassing them with cyanide. And hundreds and thousands perished in what these places were really factories of death. The crematorium inside Auschwitz was able to process 6,000 bodies a day. And these factories producing death ran for 7 days and 24 hours constantly. And all the while, Germany was fighting the war on the front. Everywhere they went, they collected the Jews, rounded them up, put them on the trains, and sent them to the furnace. And later, when finally Germany was defeated and the American troops went into some of these places, they could not believe the things that they found. Pile of ashes and bones found. They found all the wedding rings that they had confiscated from the Jews upon arrival. Piles and piles of shoes that they had confiscated. Hundreds of pounds, kilograms of human hair that they had shaved off the Jews and were using to make fabrics and other things. And in some museums, they have display made from all the suitcases that the Jews disembarked from the train with before being sent to their death. This was a tragic, tragic period of history. I've had the privilege of traveling to Europe the last couple of years. I've been a couple of times. First time I went with Levi, and this is Levi in Berlin in a memorial to all the Holocaust victims. It's a very, very large area which is built right where Hitler used to have his offices. And you walk through this very disturbing place, which is a monument to the 6 million Jews that lost their lives. One of the things which I started to notice when I went to Europe, in every capital city, you find these stumbling stones, they're called copper stones, they're called, and they're implanted in the pavement all over Europe. You will see them, thousands of them, and they are put in the road to memorialize where a Jew was once living before they were killed in the Holocaust, before they were taken to their death. All over Europe, we in Germany, in Prague, in Austria, in Venice, in Rome, everywhere we went, you can walk, if you're not careful, over the top of these stones. This is another memorial in Hungary, another place where they took the Jews from. Shoes belonging to the victims. One of the most emotional times for me was when I was in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam was where a little girl called Anne Frank lived. Anne Frank wrote a diary during the war before she was discovered. Some of you may have read her diary. It's very, very famous. But there were thousands and thousands of Jews taken from Amsterdam. And this is the memorial in Amsterdam to the Jews. And at first, you don't realize what you are seeing, but every one of those bricks represents a person who was killed during World War II, a Jew that was taken to their death. And this memorial just goes on and on. 3 years old, 16 years old. And you cannot believe how long it goes for. Once you go around the corner and you think maybe this is it, but it keeps on going and going. And it was a very emotional thing to witness. If we have a look at the Jewish population, you can see up until 1939, it was 16.6 million Jews in the world. After World War II, it dropped to 11.4 million. And even today, we are back up to maybe a bit more than 15 now. But even now, the Jewish population in the world has not yet fully recovered from this slaughter, from this mass murder. It's one of the most tragic events in human history. You can truly say that after World War II, the state of the Jews was one of real death. There was almost literally this scene of the valleys of dry bones all over Europe, piles of ash, and a testament to many people now no longer alive. But we know that the prophecies had said, "You, O mountains of Israel, shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they will soon come home." Ezekiel 36, "I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land." And so that promise was there. And of course, all the way through this period, Jews were starting to realize, those who survived, we can't stay in Europe. We have to go home. We have to have our own nation. And even Brother Thomas in 1852 said, "Testimony and reason therefore show that there must be a resettlement of the land of the Jews by them to a limited extent before the Battle of Armageddon." And he goes on to say, "No one need expect the appearing of Jesus to be shown, to be manifested, until a Jewish colony be lifted up as an ensign upon a hill." So what's remarkable about this is that he wrote this in 1852. 1852. And he says, we must see a Jewish nation form again before Jesus Christ returns. And of course, this is what happens next. In the most amazing events, Jews started to return to Palestine. Suddenly, the British, who remember had control of this area, were in a real difficult situation because Jews were coming from everywhere. And if we have a look at the Jewish immigration from 1919, you can see here with the British Mandate, they start to come back a little bit, but look at the spike after 1948, after the war, Jews starting to return in monumental numbers. And this because they realize that we need to have a home where we can be safe. And so one of the most amazing headlines that you will ever see is that in 1948, it said the state of Israel is born. Almost exactly 50 years after Theodore Herzl had said that it would happen, and almost exactly 100 years after Brother Thomas said it will definitely happen. And of course, Ezekiel and Jeremiah said it thousands of years before that. So I have to finish because I know we've gone a little bit over time tonight. But let me just show you this. Look at this period between 1882 to 1928. A little set of aliyahs, a little set of returns. First, the second, the third, the fourth, as a result of the Zionist movement. But not many Jews. It was when they began to be severely persecuted that they began to return in very, very large numbers. They were hunted and they returned by the hundreds of thousands. And so we get to the Jewish population today, and there's 15.3 million Jews worldwide. Remember, not as many as there were before the Holocaust. And 46% of Jews alive today live in Israel, and there's still 6 million who live in the USA. And of course, what we know is that eventually part of God's plan is to gather all the Jews, all the house of Israel, and bring them back to the land under their king, under their Messiah. So let me just finish with this section from Ezekiel and the chapter that we began reading. Sound and movement but no breath. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I looked, and behold, there was sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. And here's the thing, what's going to give them breath? What's going to be giving them life? It's the Spirit of God. It's a new heart, a heart that's going to recognize their Messiah. So, what have we seen at the moment? Well, we've seen the state of Israel born. And we've seen a sound, we've seen a rattling, we've seen maybe bones come together, as it were. So, we have something that's formed in Israel, a nation, but no breath yet. All right. Israel, even though it's back in the land in the most remarkable circumstances, is still back in unbelief. They still don't know that Jesus is their Messiah. They still have not been brought back into covenant relationship with God. That's yet to happen. But all the signs, all the sounds and the rattlings and all the things that have happened in the last couple of centuries, these most amazing events show us that God is still working with this people and his plan is on track. So we're going to leave that there for tonight. I think that's a lot for us to digest, I hope. And we're going to continue this overview study, which is what it is really. And next week, God willing, we will have study 4 on the ungodliness of Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Josh, for the wonderful study that you give provided for us. May we, brothers and sisters, gain insight and learn new things about the history of Israel and the Holocaust from the study given by our Brother Josh. Maraming salamat, Brother Josh, sa inyo pong binigay na magandang study para sa amin. Mga kapatid, tayo ay nagkaroon ng mga bagong mga aral patungkol at kaalaman patungkol sa uh, history ng Israel at sa nangyaring Holocaust sa kapanahunan ng Nazi. At